Chapter 25 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 25. Trev's Engagement. That had been the happiest evening which General Trelawney had known for some months. Almost for the first time since his homecoming, the house had been a house of mirth. He had laughed like a boy and had thrown off all thoughts of care and sorrow. He had sung old songs with gusto. He had revealed a sense of humour of which few thought him capable, and had entered into the merriment of the evening as though he had not a care upon his heart. "Never knew Dad had it in him," remarked John to his friend Davenport, who was of the party. "Why, he's younger than any of us." "Yes, he's broken out in a new place, hasn't he?" replied Davenport. "Up to now he's always been the dignified pukka officer. Why, he could earn his living on the stage. He seems to have forgotten what a great officer he is, and acts like a kid." And this was true. All that military precision and more than a suggestion of stateliness which was characteristic of him had been thrown aside. For months, in spite of the honours which had been heaped upon him, and in spite of the encomiums which had been passed upon him in high places, General Trelawney's face had revealed a sad, disappointed man. He had a genius for affection. No man thought more for his wife and children than he. He never made a plan but that they participated in it, and before his return to England his one thought was how he could make his children happy. Perhaps that was why his disappointment was so great at the attitude, especially of Eleanor and Peggy. It had come upon him almost like a thunderbolt, and neither honour nor success could atone for what seemed to him the tragedy of his children's lives. He was still anything but a rich man, although his promotion had meant a larger income, but he had enough to live in affluence and to grant any reasonable desire of those he loved. But the things he hoped for had been made impossible. Eleanor had, to all intents and purposes, refused his affections. She had resented what seemed to him the commonest essentials of home discipline, while Peggy had preferred to link her life to a man who was utterly unworthy rather than share his home and his love. His boy Trev, too, had disappointed him. Not that he was a bad fellow. Indeed, in some respects he was proud of him. He was tall and handsome, and made a smart officer. He had also done fairly well in his regiment, but the father had been saddened by his son's selfishness and spendthrift habits. He had lived only for himself, and had run up debts without a thought of the suffering which he might inflict by doing so. But today the General had been happy, even in spite of his two daughters, and the reason was that Trev had come home from Ireland. Not only that, he had come home changed, almost out of recognition. For some time after going to Ireland, Trev's letters had been disappointing. Mostly they had been complaints of what a beastly hole Ireland was to live in, and of the expenses which he could not meet. Then, suddenly, the father thought he saw a change in his letters. They were no longer filled with grumbling, and no mention was made of an increased allowance. This was followed by the news that Trev had obtained leave and was coming back for at least a fortnight. He had arrived home on the previous day, and both father and mother had welcomed him with outstretched arms. "This is splendid, Trev," declared the General. "And you say you have a whole fortnight?" "Hope so, Dad," said Trev with a laugh. "But is anything the matter? Why, my boy, you look a bit seedy and worried, and the little mother doesn't look as rosy as she used to. Why is it? Don't you worry about us, my boy." "But I do, Dad," replied Trev. "You don't look nearly so well as you did when I saw you in Plymouth. Is there something wrong? Money, or anything of that sort? Why should you think that?" Trev was silent a minute. "I'm afraid I've caused you a lot of bother, sir, and I want to tell you that I'm ashamed of myself. I am, really." "Why, my boy, is anything the matter with you?" "Oh, no, sir," and Trev laughed merrily. "But I was a fool, I know, and a spendthrift fool into the bargain. I thought, but that's all over, sir." "I don't understand you," said the General. "I'll tell you about it directly, sir." The General saw that there was a new light in his boy's eyes, that a wondrous change had come over him. "But where are the girls?" went on Trev. "Why aren't they here?" "You don't know? You've never heard?" queried the General. "No. Of course they have not written me, but there's nothing new in that. They never have written me, and I'm afraid I have been just as careless. But where are they? Is anything the matter?" "My boy," said the General, "that's the whole trouble." "What's the whole trouble?" In a few words his father told him. He softened the story as much as possible, but at best it was a tragic business, and the young soldier saw the meaning of his father's drawn and haggard face and the wistful look in his mother's eyes. "Yes, it's a bad business," said the General at length, "and it's blackened everything. But I'm glad to see you, my boy, glad to have you home. Now then, tell me about yourself. You look better, happier." "Yes, I am," replied the young officer. "Dad, I'm ashamed of myself. I am, really. I want you to forgive me." "To forgive you? I don't understand, my boy. Have you done anything wrong?" "Oh, no, sir. No, I've done nothing wrong. That is, in the way you think. But I've been a mean, selfish cuss, and my eyes are opened. I want to tell you about it. Why, when you came down to see me at Plymouth, my one thought of your coming was a sort of pride because you'd won a big name, and because I thought you'd pay my debts. And I can see now how disappointed you must have been. You came back after all those years, and well, we won't talk about that now, but my eyes are opened, Dad. But I don't understand, my boy," and there was a catch in the General's voice. "You will when you have seen her, sir." "Seen who?" "Yes, seen who?" repeated Mrs. Trelawney eagerly. "May I bring her here, sir? She's in England, in London for that matter." "What is it, my boy?" asked the father eagerly. "Have you fallen in love? Are you engaged?" "Fallen in love? I should rather think I have," replied Trev, and his eyes were moist as he spoke. "But engaged? I wish I were. But let me tell you about it, sir." "But who is it, Trev?" repeated Mrs. Trelawney, her voice tremulous. "The greatest, sweetest, best, truest girl in all the world," cried Trev hilariously. "I came home mostly on account of that. It was difficult to get away, but I persisted and persisted until the CO consented. I met her near Belfast, sir. Her father has a place there, and I had to go to Belfast on duty. It wasn't a long job, but I had to go there for a week, and I met her and fell in love at first sight. She comes of a Cornish family, too. Think of that. Do you know the Penryns, Dad?" "I've heard of them, certainly." "They're not very rich," went on Trev, "but they're your sort, Dad. Mr. Arthur Penryn, that's Mary's father, has a little place not far from Belfast, as I told you, and he was sent over to Ireland on some government work. A fine old chap he is, just the perfect type of an old English squire, and keen too, keen as mustard. As for Mrs. Penryn, mother will love her at first sight. Well, we met at a dance, and I was up to my neck in 2 minutes." And again Trev laughed hilariously. "Of course I was not introduced to her as a nameless nobody," he went on. "When Mrs. Penryn knew I was your son, it was all right. As for Mary, I say, Dad, you must see her." "Of course I must see her," laughed the General, who had followed Trev's sketchy and somewhat disconnected story with great interest. "But tell me more, my boy." "Yes, tell us more. Tell us everything, Trev," cried Mrs. Trelawney. "Well, sir, as I told you, I fell head over heels in love, and she's made everything new to me, sir. She isn't the ordinary society girl, although of course the family moves among the best people. She's a real girl, and it was she who made me ashamed of myself. She made me see what a selfish, mean brute I had been." "In what way, my son?" "Oh, I don't know. But when I saw how fond she was of her father and mother, and how unselfish she was, and how she was always willing to sacrifice her own pleasure for them, and how before she did anything, however little, she considered whether it would please them or not, I thought of the way I'd behaved. It was that kind of thing, sir. She made a new fellow of me." "I'm awfully glad to hear what you say, my boy. But did you say you were engaged?" "No, sir. I wish I were. But I believe it's all right. In fact, I feel sure it is." "Well, then tell me how matters stand." "It's like this," and again Trev laughed happily. "As I told you, I lost my heart at the dance. Of course I didn't say anything. I dared not. But I met her as often as I could, and I got the CO to send me to that district more than once, and as I did my work fairly well, he seemed willing, and every time I saw her, well, you know, sir, how a chap feels. So I spoke to Mr. Penryn." "Yes, yes," said the General. "What did he say?" "Well, he asked about you, sir. He asked whether I'd written and told you. He said that marriage was such a serious matter that you ought not to be left out of it. But I could not help letting her know how I felt, and the upshot of it all is, sir, that when they returned to England I got leave, and here I am, and they're in London, and I want you to ask them up here. Will you?" "Of course I will. Nothing will give me greater pleasure. I don't know Mr. Arthur Penryn, but I know of him." "They have a house in Kensington, sir, 36 Parkside Gardens. Can't you ring them up right away?" "Won't that be rather rushing it, Trev?" "It may be, sir, but I don't think so. You have no idea what a splendid girl she is. She's made me see everything differently, and I want you to know her. I'm sure you'll love her. She's not a bit showy or that kind of thing, but she's a true girl, sir, and made me see everything differently." This was the story which Trev had to tell his father, a story which made the General's heart beat with joy. It was not very eloquently told, yet it revealed the fact that Trev Trelawney had been brought to see the truth through the influence of a pure girl, that his love for one who was pure-minded, unselfish, and unsullied had brought to life possibilities which had been long dormant in his nature. Before the day was over, Mr. and Mrs. Penryn and their daughter Mary had promised to dine at the Trelawneys on the following evening, and as a consequence Trev was in the seventh heaven of delight. When John came home, Trev, instead of meeting him as he had in the past with a rather supercilious stare and an attitude of patronage, was eager for his brother's company, eager to tell him his story. "I say, Dad," said John, after a long talk with his brother, "you know Dick Davenport had promised to come here to dinner tomorrow night. Hadn't I better tell him not to come?" "Not a bit of it," said the General, after a moment's reflection. "Dick's a nice lad, and there's not the slightest reason for putting off his visit." "But you must get home early, you know, Jack," said Trev. "It's going to be a white vest affair, I tell you. You wait until you have seen her, old man." It came about, therefore, that on the night of the painful scene between Barnes and Peggy, that the Trelawney family were on the tiptoe of expectation and delight, and the happiest evening the General had known for many months. Especially was he delighted with Mary Penryn. For once, at all events, the lover had not painted in too bright a colour the woman he loved. As Trev had said, she was not a showy girl, but her quiet humour, her love of laughter, her sweetness of disposition, and the love she evidently bore to her father and mother simply charmed General Trelawney. "Trev, my boy, go in and win," he said, before the Penryns had been in the house half an hour. "You have my fullest approval and consent." "Isn't she splendid, Dad?" asked the young fellow. "She's something better than that. She's a really good girl, and if she says yes, well, you'll have a treasure." "But I couldn't get it fixed up tonight, could I?" "Why not?" laughed the General. "I wouldn't wait 10 minutes if I were in your place. 10 minutes, not 2. "But Mr. Penryn's old-fashioned and believes in the convenances." "Convenances be hanged," laughed the General. "I'll speak to him. It's all right, my boy. I can see it's all right." The Trelawneys had arranged for the Penryns to come an hour before dinner, and 10 minutes before the dinner gong sounded, Trev had managed to be alone with Mary. Trev Trelawney's proposal was hardly in the nature of a proposal at all, because the young people had tacitly settled the matter beforehand, and were only waiting for the consent of the parents. "I say, Mary," said Trev eagerly, "Dad's head over heels in love with you. He is really." "Not so much as I am with him," laughed the girl. "And your father is agreeable if you are," persisted Trev. "I say, Mary, may I? Will you have me?" It was all settled, and when the dinner gong sounded, and as they took their places at the table, the General's eyes were moist and his voice a little husky. As for Mrs. Trelawney, she was sobbing for joy, even although there was some sadness in her sobs, because she remembered the 2 girls who were away. "I say, Dick," said John to Davenport, who had been alone with his friend ever since the latter had arrived, "this is no place for us. We're simply out of it." "I wish I were in it," was Davenport's reply. "If it would make me look as happy as Trev looks. By Jove, he's altogether changed. He's like a new man." "What are you 2 boys laughing at?" asked the General. "Oh, Dick wants to sing it's love that makes the world go round, and I won't let him," laughed John. This was the signal for a good deal of light-hearted laughter, and after that everything went merrily. "I want to give you a toast," said the General towards the end of the dinner. "A speech, a speech!" shouted John and Davenport together. "It's not going to be much of a speech. My heart's too full," said the General. "But I can't let this occasion pass without saying a few words. I'm going to ask you to drink the health of these two young people. I have not known Mary 2 hours yet, but I am over head and ears in love with her. Perhaps you'll say I'm speaking impulsively, but I'll say this nevertheless. If I'd searched the world over, I could not have found anyone whom I would rather have for Trev's wife. I have not talked with her half an hour altogether. Trev wouldn't let me, but I have seen enough. She's a good girl, and a sweet girl, and a girl of which any father might be well proud. After all, it doesn't take long to know people, and I can always tell in 5 minutes whether I like them or not, and I'm just in love with Mary, and so is my wife here, and so I say with a full heart, God bless you, my dear, may you be happy, and you too, my boy, and I trust and believe that you'll be worthy of the dear girl you have won, and here the General broke down. For a moment he stood still, smiling, unable to speak, then crossing to Mary's side and putting his arms round her neck, he kissed her. "God bless you, my dear," he said. "I say, Dad," shouted Trev, almost beside himself with joy. "You are coming it a bit strong, you know. Where do I come in? That's what I want to know." Then Mr. Penryn, a bluff squire of the old school, said a few words about Trev, and expressed all sorts of good wishes for him, after which there was general handshaking. It was at that moment that the servant entered the room and came to the General. "A gentleman wishes to see you, sir," she said. "Who is it? What is his name?" he asked. "I don't know, sir." "Tell him I'm engaged. I can't see him tonight." "Yes, sir, but he said he came on very important business. Very important. He said it was very urgent that he should see you, sir, and that he would not keep you more than 5 minutes." "Oh, well, then I'll see him. You'll excuse me, Penryn, won't you?" Then he went out and met Barnes. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Jim's Appeal for Help. "What do you want?" repeated the General when Barnes did not reply. "Why have you come here?" "It's about Peg." "Yes. What about Peggy?" "Well, sir, we're in a bit of a hole." The General looked at Barnes, and a feeling of disgust came over him. He had just left a scene of happiness. He had that night welcomed a prospective daughter-in-law to whom his heart had gone out at first sight. She was a lady, too, refined and cultured, and he had been very proud and happy. Now, as he looked at Barnes, showy, but common to the fingertips, he felt a kind of nausea. The thought that his daughter could have picked up and married a fellow like this almost maddened him. For the General was a proud man, proud of his name, proud of his associations, proud of an unsullied reputation. He had all the instincts of an English gentleman, and thus to have a fellow like this coming to his house and telling him that his daughter Peggy was in trouble almost overwhelmed him. Still he kept himself outwardly calm. "What have I to do with it?" he asked. "I need not to repeat to you the history of the whole miserable affair, or how I forbade you to seek my daughter's company in any way. You took your own line, you defied me, and now I fail to see what it has to do with me." "She is your daughter still, General, and she loves you still," said Barnes. He had rehearsed what he hoped would be the course of the interview, and he determined to make a strong point of this. He felt certain that in spite of the General's anger, his love for Peggy was as strong as ever, so he adopted this line of attack. And from his standpoint he was right. There was no more vulnerable point in the General's armour than this, and Barnes saw it. "Of course I know we were wrong," he went on, "but we could not help it. I loved Peg and Peg loved me. Of course she was a bit wilful and liked her own way, but at bottom she's terribly fond of you, General." In spite of the fact that the General knew the fellow was telling lies, his words affected him. So much did he yearn for the love of his child that the words, spoken even as they were by Barnes, brought tears to his eyes. "We were as happy as turtle doves," went on Barnes, seeing the impression he had made, "and we should have got on well but for this money business. You know how dear things are, General, and I'd be the last man in the world to say anything against Peg, but she's not very economical, you know, sir, and she don't know how to manage very well. She wasn't brought up that way. However, I'm not going to blame Peg. I love her too much, but there it is. We're up against it." Trelawney felt sure that the fellow was playing a part, and even although his love went out to his child, he could not help hardening his heart. He felt cynical too, and more than a little bitter. "Still, again I inquire, what have I to do with it?" "Perhaps you don't think what a bitter pill this is to me," said Barnes, ignoring the General's question, "especially after the way you treated me, and what you said to me when we met last. Of course it was a mistake, and nobody feels it more than my own people. They have reproached me again and again for giving up another girl for Peg. Nice girl she was, too, had a paying little millinery business of her own, and doing well. Why, if I'd married Agnes Parks, I need not to have done a stroke of work. But there, it's no use talking about that. I was in love and married Peggy." The General made a motion of disgust. "Yes, and came to me with the proposal that if I would recognize you, you would, but I dare not speak of it." "Oh, no, sir," broke in Barnes. "I can understand that too. But why did I do it? It was for Peg's sake. I know I tried to deceive you by telling you that we weren't married, but I thought that it was my only way to get your recognition. But it wasn't for myself. It was for Peg. You don't believe me because you don't understand me. But here was our position. We loved each other, and because you put the kibosh on everything, we had to get married without your consent. And I, in order to get your recognition, told you what was not true. I admit it was a mistake, sir, but I did the honourable thing. However, it's no use talking about that. We're in Queer Street, sir. Say Peg has been a bit extravagant if you like. I'm not the one to throw up that against her, but I don't know how we're going to live. I thought I should have got an increase of pay, but times have got bad, and I haven't, and now we can't pay our way. We owe 3 weeks' rent, and Peg is nearly starving." "Starving!" ejaculated the General. "Well, we don't know where the next week's food is to come from, and there you are. Here's a letter I got to-day, telling me that if I don't pay up the rent at once, I shall be kicked out. And here are these bills. I'm not come for myself. I could manage all right. But it's Peg. She's breaking her heart. Some might say she's a bit unreasonable. I've offered to take her home to Camden Town and live with my mother and sisters, but she won't. She's too proud to associate with them. If she would do that, we might rub along, but if nothing is done for us, we will be on the streets." There was so much truth in this statement that Barnes was able to speak almost convincingly. "What do you owe?" asked the General. "How much is it?" 3 weeks' rent at £2.5 a week, that's £6 15s, and there's these other bills that come to £8 4s, that's nearly £15. I would not come for myself. It's Peg I'm troubling about." "You should have thought of it before you did this mad, dishonourable thing." "I know I should, and I'm downright sorry, but what's done is done. Besides, it's harder to live than I thought. Prices are going up like mad, and Peg's nearly out of her head." "But why have you come to me?" the General could not help saying. "Come to you, sir?" cried Barnes, with a show of righteous indignation. "Because I didn't think you were made of stone. What I said to Peg to-night was, that if you'd allow us, say, £2 a week, we don't ask much, you see, we might rub along." The General did not reply. The whole affair was so sordid, so piteous that he could not. Never did he despise the fellow as he despised him now. He saw through the mask he was wearing, understood the tones of his voice, and loathed his presence. But he could not close his heart against his child. He could not bear to think of her being in want. He realized the kind of furnished rooms which could be had for £2 a week, and felt what Peggy must be suffering by living in them. He knew that Barnes had moved from the place where their last interview took place, and had been informed of the part of the city where they now lived, a common, unsavoury, and squalid quarter. "Come now, General," and Barnes, as he thought he saw the other relenting, spoke eagerly. "Can't you, for Peg's sake, let bygones be bygones? Why can't we live happy together? What's the use of keeping up this bitterness? Whatever you may say, I'm your son-in-law. Why can't you do the Christian thing and own it? Why can't we be friendly like? I'll not disgrace you. I was an officer in the army just as you are, and I could pass muster with any of your fine friends. And I ask you straight, can you, a professedly Christian man, shut your daughter and the man she has chosen out of your heart and home? I mean to get on, and when things have settled down a bit, I'll make my way. Peg shall have her motor car and her fine dresses with the best of 'em, but just now we're under water, and Peg's heart is breaking. What we want is just a little help in money, and a little love and sympathy. I'm willing to forgive all the hard things you've said to me, and it seems to me that it's your duty to forgive anything which I have said in a temper, and I'll admit I've got my pride, same as you have. That might hurt you. Now then, General, here's my hand on it." Barnes imagined this was a very moving speech. He had thought it out while walking from the subway station to the Trelawney home, and he expected a great deal from it. The General had been brought up in an old-fashioned school, and had always maintained the sacredness of marriage ties. He loathed the thought of easy divorces, and had always held that people once married took each other until death parted them. If that were so, his child's husband had become, in a very sacred way, his son, and in spite of the loathing he felt for Barnes, the fact struck home now. Perhaps this revealed itself in his features, for Barnes, who had been watching him closely, went on eagerly. "Yes, I can see you hate me," he said, "but hatred is not a Christian thing, General. To err is human, but to forgive is divine. And what I ask is, can't you forgive us?" Again the keen eyes of the older man pierced the mask of the other, but still he hesitated. "I must think about it," he said, half unconsciously. At that moment there was a knock at the door. "May I come in, Dad?" and Trev entered the room. Dick Davenport said he must be going, sir, and I thought you might like to speak to him before he went." This was perfectly true, but it was not the only reason why Trev interrupted them. He had an idea that his father had a visitor whom he wanted to get rid of, and as they wanted the General back with them badly, he thought he might help him by going to him. Besides, the 5 minutes which the servant mentioned were far more than up. "I'm sorry, Trev, but I can't speak to Davenport just now. Will you tell him that I'm engaged, and ask him to come again soon? And will you come back here for a minute?" Trev gave a quick searching glance at his father's face, and then looked towards Barnes. He had a suspicion that something was wrong. "Certainly, Dad." He left the room as he spoke, but returned a minute later. "This," said the General, "is the man I told you about." "What, the fellow who Yes," said the General. The young officer looked at Barnes intently and quickly summed him up. "Lieutenant Trelawney, I believe," said Barnes. "Glad to see you. Yes, in a way we're relations," and he giggled nervously as he held out his hand, but Trev did not take it. Instead, he looked at his father as if for further information. "It's the old story," said the General, a little bitterly, and then in a few words he described the purport of Barnes's visit. "And he wants you to receive him here as your son-in-law." And every tone of his voice was a sting which even Barnes felt. "Yes, and I am his son-in-law too, and your brother-in-law. You can't get over that," blustered Barnes, whose temper was rising. "I suppose you don't want to see your sister going out charing, do you?" "Father, shall I kick him out of the house?" asked Trev. "I will if you'll let me." "Come, none of that," cried Barnes. "Two can play at that game." "Wait a minute," said the General. "There's Peg to consider. I must think, and I must consult your mother." "But, Dad, you couldn't let that bounder come here. Think of Mary." "Yes, I am thinking of her, my boy, and I'm thinking of Peg too." He walked to the door as he spoke and opened it. "There, you can go now," he said, looking at Barnes. "Do you mean to say you'll do nothing then? Why, it's downright cruel and unchristian." "That's not your affair." "Look here, I've come to you straight, and I've eaten humble pie because of your daughter, but if anything happens to her, don't you blame me, that's all." "This way, please." And Barnes, noting the look in the General's eyes, left the room and walked towards the front door, followed by Trev. When he had reached the drive, he found Trev by his side. "Now, Mr. Barnes, remember," and there was an intensity in the young fellow's voice, "I know all about you. My brother told me. Yes, I've heard of that affair at the Cosmopolitan Hotel. You lied then. I expect you have been lying tonight. But I shall make it my business to find out the truth, and if anything is wrong, I'll not let you off as easily as my brother did. Remember that. Now get out." Barnes walked some distance in a black rage, yet fearful all the same. He could not understand these people. They seemed to possess a power which took all the fight out of him. His blustering was all in vain, his pleading useless. He made an exclamation in 2 words, which was to the effect that he had given up all hope of salvation. "But I must be careful," he reflected presently. "After all, he may do something, and I must not put Peg's back up until all hope is gone." When the General returned to the drawing room, he found that Davenport had gone, and thus only his own family and the Penryns were there. For a little time he seemed distrait, as though he had something upon his mind which he did not know how to express. Then a flash of resolution came into his eyes. I have something to say to you," he said slowly. "Something that is painful, very painful." "Then don't say it, my friend," replied Mr. Penryn. "But I must," said the General. "It affects you in a way. You became a member of my family from to night, and because your girl and my boy are engaged, you have the right to know, and it's my duty to tell you." "Not that, Lester!" cried Mrs. Trelawney piteously, for Trev had told her who his father's visitor was. "Yes," replied the General, "I must. I have always believed in absolute frankness, and this is not a matter that I can keep secret. Up to half an hour ago this has been one of the happiest evenings of my life. You remember, however, that I was called out, and it is about that I want to speak." He quickly told the story, gave it in its gaunt, unpleasant outlines. When he had finished, Mr. Penryn held out his hand. "I'm sorry for you," he said. "It's the kind of thing that's happening on all hands these days. It's seen in different ways in different grades of society. Thank God I know nothing about it myself, as my Mary has never become imbued with these modern notions. But several of my friends are troubled in the same way. They say little about it, but the thing's there." "Thank you," replied the General. "I felt I ought to tell you, seeing that the two families are to become united. But it's a bitter pill to swallow, my friend." "My God, it must be. Still, it's not so bad as it is with some. After all, your youngest daughter is married, while the other, although it must be terribly painful to you, may see her foolishness and come home." "Yes, there's that. But this is the question. What ought I to do? I told Eleanor that my doors were always open to her, that if she comes back and is prepared to accept the life of our home such as it is, she shall receive a daughter's welcome. I have said the same to Peg. But does that mean that I am to accept that fellow? Does the Christian law demand that, Penryn? Tell me." "No," cried John hotly. "No law, human or divine, demands that. Would you let that moth-eaten poisonous worm come here? Think what he did, Mr. Penryn." And, boy-like, he impulsively told of Barnes's proposal at the Cosmopolitan Hotel. "Could we have that thing here? Why, he hasn't the manners of a yard dog, nor the morals of a giraffe." "I agree with John," cried Trev. "You could not do it, Dad. You simply couldn't. Why, think of Mary having to and he looked tenderly at the girl who had become engaged to him that night. "Why, Mary, if you saw him, a common vulgar bounder, you'd understand me." Mary Penryn did not speak. There had been a strange look in her eyes while the General had told his story, a look of yearning and tenderness and pity, and something more. She rose from her chair and went to Mrs. Trelawney. "I'm so sorry," she whispered in her ear. "So very sorry. Oh, what you must have felt." And she kissed her affectionately. "I want to do what's right, Penryn," said the General. "I would be the last to do anything that would weaken the meaning of marriage. But can I, ought I, to welcome that fellow to my house? Ought I to admit him here as my son-in-law under any pretext? I ask you as a Christian man." "No," remarked Mr. Penryn after a long silence. "Ought I to help them?" went on the General. "When I last saw Peggy she was still unrepentant, still defiant. Her mother wrote to her telling her that our doors were open to her, but that we could not receive that man, and her reply was that she wanted neither our help nor our recognition, and that she proposed to live independently of us. She also told her mother that her doors would be shut against us. I'm sorry to have to say this, Penryn, on this night of all others, but I want to be absolutely open with you, and I want your advice. I want to help my child. I must help her. But in helping her, I am helping her husband. Ought I to do that? He's a great, strong, coarse individual. He can make his way well enough. That is, he can earn enough for his bread and cheese. But Peg is different. She is my child." "Of course," said Mr. Penryn, "you can't help your daughter without at the same time helping Barnes too." "I see that, and I must help her. I simply can't see my child in want." "But we can't have that fellow here, Dad," cried Trev. I wouldn't let Mary know him. One must have some self-respect, you know." "What kind of a fellow is he?" asked Mr. Penryn. The General sketched him perfectly, yet justly. He made plain to the other the kind of pushing, half-educated fellow who thought it a fine thing to be an officer, and who had all sorts of puffed-up ideas as to how a gentleman should behave, but who, in spite of everything, revealed the real texture of his character. A vulgar fellow, who by his showy good looks and fine physique was calculated to capture an impulsive, unthinking girl, but who had not even a nodding acquaintance with the first principles of honour. A snob, a bounder, and a bully combined, who, under the veneer of a cheap education, tried to pose as a gentleman. "Yes," continued the General, "and then, Penryn, then? It's a ghastly problem to me, as you may imagine. I am as sure as that 2 and 2 make 4, that Peggy, in spite of her stubbornness and wilfulness and rebelliousness, in spite of the fact that she has cared for this man, in a way, will sooner or later understand the kind of fellow he is, and detest him. She will feel that his very touch is an insult. What then? Does a ceremony in a registry office, or in a church for that matter, make them man and wife? I know I have very strict views about marriage, but this business has made me think furiously. Isn't marriage dead when all respect, all honour, all love are gone? But there, we'll think no more about it now. I'm dreadfully grieved, Penryn, that this should have happened." "My dear fellow," replied the squire, "a thing like that might happen to anybody, and is in fact happening to thousands to-day, and the secret of the whole trouble is the lack of the religious instinct." "That is the secret of all our present day troubles," cried Mrs. Trelawney. "Oh, I did hope during the war that we as a nation were being purified. It was all so fine at first. People of every class were being uplifted. They were doing great things. Millions of young fellows were offering their lives as a sacrifice. Young girls brought up in refined homes were gladly undertaking the meanest and the most painful duties that they might render help. And we were all saying that we were fighting for a great peace, and now that peace has come, there is no peace. The turmoil and the strife and the selfishness seem to be worse than ever. Nothing is settled, everything is in a state of unrest, and we seem to be drifting we know not where." "No doubt you are right, Alice," said the General, "but we mustn't sadden these young people. Trev, you dog, you ought to be a happy fellow." "I am," cried Trev. "I'm the happiest chap in the world. And you, Mary, you are not very miserable, are you?" "Thank God for you, my dear," said the General as he kissed Mary good night. "I'm happy in spite of everything, Penryn. I feel as though Mary has brought a new interest, a new hope, a new joy to life. God bless you, my dear fellow." "Alice, we must go and see Peg first thing to-morrow morning," said the General to his wife, when their visitors were gone and they found themselves alone. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 27. The Home of the Barnes. Peggy stood in the shabby little room, miserable, ashamed, yet angry and defiant. It was now past 10 in the morning, and Barnes had gone to his work. The breakfast things had not yet been cleared away, and the room looked even worse than usual. When she saw her father and mother, she instinctively rushed to the door to let them in, but when they stood within the room, and she realized the sordid squalor of her surroundings, a flush of angry shame swept over her. For a moment the tears rushed to her eyes, and a sob caught in her throat, but she quickly mastered herself. She remembered what she had said to her father the day before she left her home. She caught herself thinking of their last interview, when they had come to the rooms to which Barnes had first brought her. Her old pride surged back in her. Her old sense of defiance dominated her. Poor as she was, miserable as she might be, squalid as were her surroundings, she would not let her father see any weakness in her. She would hold by the bargain she had made. She would not admit that she had made a mistake. Barnes had not told her where he had been on the previous night. When he had returned, very late, he had not spoken to her, and that morning he had been sullen and out of temper. He had given dark hints as to what would happen if something did not turn up, but he made no direct statement as to what had taken place. She was, therefore, ignorant as to how her father and mother had learnt her whereabouts, and knew nothing of Barnes's visit. "I could not help coming to you, my little girl," said the General. "You are in trouble, aren't you?" She did not reply, but looked at him silently, defiantly. "Now tell us all about it," went on her father. "Let us hear about your difficulties." "What difficulties?" "The difficulties the man you married, told me about last night." "Told you last night? What do you mean?" "Didn't you know he came to Hampstead?" There was a quick flash in the girl's eyes. Instinctively she understood what had taken place, that Barnes had been to her father to appeal for help, and she felt more humiliated than ever. "My darling, I'm so sorry. Tell us all about it," cried Mrs. Trelawney. "There's nothing to tell," replied the girl. "I'm not complaining." But, pleaded Mrs. Trelawney. "Surely, Peg, my darling, you'll tell your old mother." "I'm sorry he went to you," said the girl doggedly. "I knew nothing about it. He had no right to bother you." "But, my dear, we can't know of your trouble and not come to you." "I don't see why not. I took my own course. I forfeited all claims upon you when I left home. I must bear my own burden." The girl's spirit was unbroken. A proud look still flashed from her eyes. She might suffer, but she would suffer in silence, as far as they were concerned. Never would she willingly admit that she had made a mistake. "But he told us that you were in debt, almost starving." "He told you that, did he?" "That's why we came," said the General. "You are still our little Kitty, Peggy." Again the tears rushed into her eyes. The touch of tenderness well nigh broke her down, but again she steeled herself and became defiant. "I ask for no pity," she said. "Won't you come back with us and spend the day at home?" pleaded her mother. "We will bring you back here in time for your husband's dinner." "You'll not let him come home then?" The question flashed from her with the suddenness of a pistol shot. They were both silent. They had made up their minds on this question. "I see. He's not good enough for you. I may come home, but not he." Still they remained silent, but they stood looking at her, and she could not help seeing the love that shone from their eyes. The girl understood. She saw what was in her father's mind as plainly as if he had spoken. She knew that he regarded Barnes as a vulgar outsider, a man with whom he would not willingly associate, one who was low bred and contemptible, and she knew they were right, but she would not give in. Something within her rose in defiance of her father's feeling. She saw Barnes almost as they saw him, but something, she could not tell what, made her loyal to him. She would tell them nothing of his brutality, of his meanness, of the things he had said to her. "If he is not good enough to come to your house, I am not good enough." For a moment the General was nonplussed. He could not help admiring her loyalty to the man whose unworthiness he was sure she realized. He was a man of quick understanding, and he knew the kind of things he would say to her, knew of the reproaches with which he would taunt her. But she would not admit them to him. "But Peggy, my darling, we want to help you," cried the mother. "I don't want your help." "But he told your father that you would be thrown into the streets if something was not done." "Then I'll be thrown into the streets." "But we want you, Peggy," and there was a tremor in General Trelawney's voice. "Do you know Trev's home? And he's engaged?" The girl became interested in a moment. "Trev home? Engaged? To whom?" "To the sweetest girl I ever met," cried the General. "He met her in Ireland. Her name's Mary Penryn. She and her people were at our house last night. We all fell in love with her right away. And Trev is such a changed fellow. You never saw such a difference in a boy. The Penryns are a Cornish family. They have a place. It is little more than a farm, just outside Falmouth, and they're awfully nice people." "And she, what's she like? Is she good looking?" "Perhaps some might not call her so," replied her father, "but she's such a sweet, unselfish, good girl." The words made her realize where she was, what she had done, and again the look of defiance came back. She wanted to see Trev's fiancée more than words could say, for blood was thicker than water, and in her own way she had always been fond of Trev, but her father's words were a reproach. "Sweet, unselfish, good," she sneered. "I suppose she's one of the pious sort." "Yes," replied the General quietly. "She is. She says nothing about it, but she is. If Trev had searched the world over, he could not have found any one who would have pleased me more." The girl did not speak a word, but looked out of the window on the dirty, dismal street with unseeing eyes. "If you'll come home," said the mother, "I'm sure Trev will go and bring her to meet you. He doesn't need any excuse to be with her, I can tell you," and she laughed as she spoke. "No," replied Peg, "I don't want to see her. Of course you've told her all about me, and I don't want to be introduced to my new sister as the bad girl of the family. For that matter, I'm not the bad girl of the family. I've only done what I felt it my right to do. Have you seen Eleanor lately?" "No," replied Mrs. Trelawney with a sigh. "We have not." "Is there any use your waiting here longer?" asked Peggy after an awkward silence. "This kind of thing doesn't make me any happier, and I don't suppose it's very pleasant for you. I'm not penitent a bit. I'm just the same as ever I was. I'm not going home to be pitied by the servants and patronized. Besides, I have my duty to my husband." She said this as a kind of afterthought, and she flung the words at her father almost insolently. "Very well, Peg," said the General. "Then there's no more to be said, except this. We want to help you if we can." "I refuse your help. I won't accept anything. If you won't recognize Jim, I don't want your help." "Do you think I can recognize him?" asked the General quietly. "Would you, Peg, like me to have him in my house and introduce him as the husband you have chosen?" Perhaps there was something more in her father's tones than in his words that helped the girl to see what his feelings were, and although she wanted to answer in the affirmative, she could not. Something kept back the words. "Yet we want to help you, my little girl. went on the General tenderly. "And I don't want to be helped." "Then we may as well go, Alice. Good morning, my dear. Please remember that your parents' house is always open to you." In spite of himself, he could not help the emphasis which, almost unconsciously, he laid on the last word. Peggy watched them go, saw them get into the motor car which stood near the door, and drive away. Then she stood for a long time motionless, her mind far away. She was thinking about 1,000 things she could not put into words. Presently she realized that there was a packet on the table, and almost listlessly she looked at it. It was a long envelope, and in her father's handwriting she saw the words, "For Peggy." Eagerly she opened it. At that moment she forgot all her pride and her stubbornness, forgot, too, that sense of defiance which she was glad she had maintained. The envelope contained the letter from the landlord of the house, telling them that if the rent was not paid they would be forthwith ejected. It also contained the bills which Barnes had shown her the night before. These Barnes had left at the General's house. She saw at a glance that the bills were receipted and that the account for the rent was settled. Then she caught sight of another envelope on which was written the words, "With Dad's and Mother's love." It contained several pound notes. In spite of herself her lips quivered, and again her eyes became flooded with tears. She stood for some time holding the notes in her hand, as if undecided what to do with them. Pride, defiance, tenderness, hunger were all expressed in her eyes. Her father had helped her in spite of herself. The rent was paid, the bills were settled, and he had left her money. She saw the meaning of it. Her father still loved her, and although in helping her he was obliged to help Barnes, he would help him as little as possible. He would not recognize their marriage, but his heart went out to her. Then the floodgates of her misery were opened, and throwing herself upon the shabby, greasy lodging-house chair, she burst into heart-breaking sobs. Barnes did not come home to lunch that day, but at 6:30 in the evening he appeared with a look half of fear, half of expectation in his eyes. For in spite of the mountebank bravado which he exhibited before her, the man was afraid of her. She did not speak on his arrival, but laid his evening meal before him without a word. "Nice loving welcome, anyhow," said Barnes presently. "Aren't you going to have any dinner?" "I'm not hungry." "What's the matter?" he snarled. "That's your pride, I suppose?" And there was a sneer in her voice. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean. You went to my father last night and told him about the rent and the bills that had not been paid." "Has he been here?" asked Barnes eagerly. "What did he say?" She took the receipted accounts from the envelope and flung them before him. "There," she said, and there was infinite scorn in her voice. Barnes looked at them eagerly and noted that the bills were receipted. "That's something, anyhow," he muttered in tones of satisfaction. "But is that all, Peg? Didn't he give you anything else? Tell me all about it. What did he say?" "He said enough to make me ashamed." "Oh, what's the use of talking like that? We can't live on air. But surely this is not all. He gave you some money, didn't he?" "I told him I would not have any," replied Peg. "I didn't know he'd paid these things until he'd gone. I never felt so humiliated in my life." "Do you mean to say he offered you money and you wouldn't take it? Why, you bloomin' idiot, can't you see that—" He caught his wife's eyes as he spoke, and in spite of his anger, the sentence hung on his lips unfinished. "After all, what's this?" he went on presently. "The next week's rent will be due on Saturday, and then what are we going to do? If, instead of paying these things, he'd given you the money, it would have been something like. I could have held a part of these bills over for a few weeks, and we should have had something to go on with." "You mean that you would not have paid your debts?" "You can bet your shoes I wouldn't have paid them until I was obliged. But did he come alone?" "No, my mother came with him." "And you didn't ask them for any money?" "Certainly not." "Well, of all the blithering fools! Why, you might easily have got a £20 note out of them, but for your infernal pride. Did they say anything about your going home?" "Yes. What?" "They wanted to take me back with them." "And you wouldn't go?" "No." "Well, of all the—" Barnes's indignation and wonder seemed to be so great that he could not finish the sentence. "Why didn't you go?" "Because I didn't want to." "Did they say anything about me?" "Not much." "But they said something. What was it?" "They said they would have me, but they would not have you." "And what was your reply?" "I told them that if you were not good enough to be received, then I wasn't." Barnes was silent a few seconds. Even he understood something of what was in the girl's mind. "Do you think they will ever relent, Peg?" he asked presently. "No, they never will." "A nice Christian he is," sneered Barnes. "A nice forgiving Christian gentleman, isn't he? He'll not have his own son-in-law in his house. Dirty pride. He's no gentleman, Peg. He may be a general and all that kind of thing, but he's no gentleman, my girl." The girl's anger was aroused in spite of herself. "Of course you would say that," she remarked. "Why shouldn't I say it? It's true, isn't it?" "No, it's not true." "Then what do you mean by talking like that?" "Because you don't know what a gentleman is." She was angry with herself as she spoke. She felt that she was becoming more and more common the longer she lived with this man, felt that she was sinking to his level, and yet she could not help herself. "Look here, none of that!" cried Barnes, starting to his feet. "I'm not going to be insulted." "Very well, then, you shouldn't ask me questions. Yes, hit me if you like, but you dare not. You're afraid." He flung himself into his chair again and went on with his dinner. "Did they tell you that your brother Trev was home?" "Yes." "He's on leave, I suppose?" "Yes, he brought home his fiancée." "Oh, I see. Some swell dame, I suppose. Of course she could come home, but I'm not good enough. Who is she?" "Her name is Penryn. She comes of an old Cornish family." "Old Cornish family, eh? No wonder the country is turning Bolshevist. I shall turn Bolshevik myself soon. It would do me good to see some of these proud-stomached aristocrats thrown into the streets." Peg did not reply. For some time after this there was a silence. Barnes was evidently thinking deeply. "I'm going out," he said at length. The girl did not speak. "You don't ask me where I'm going, but I'll tell you. I'm going to get a little pleasure, a little comfort. Fat lot of comfort I get in my own home with a wife who won't be reasonable." Still Peggy kept silence. "Have you nothing to say?" "I was only wondering where I should go when you had gone." "Oh, you can go where you like. I don't care." A feeling of helplessness and hopelessness rushed over her, and in spite of all she could do, she burst into a flood of sobbing. "What's the use of that?" asked Barnes. "If you were reasonable, we might get on even yet." "Reasonable? What do you mean?" "Well, we're in a hole. While rents are as they are, we can't live in this way. There must be a change. If we are to stay together, there are only two courses open to us." "Yes, what are they?" "One is that you'll get your old man to help us." "Oh, Jim," she cried, "I can't. I simply can't. Think of the way I left them. Think of the promises you made me, and then ask yourself how I can go back to them and no, I can't do it. I really can't. I'll do anything in reason. Let's get out of London. Let's go into the country somewhere and take a little cottage. I'll work like a slave. I'll do anything. But don't ask me to accept charity in that way." "Catch me leaving London!" cried Barnes. "Catch Jim Barnes getting away from everything that makes life worth living. Besides, you talk like a fool. How can I get anything to do in the country?" "What is the other thing you have in your mind?" asked the girl. "Why, if you'd consent to go to Camden Town and live with Mother, we could save practically all our rent. That would make £2 a week difference to us. We could just manage then." But could we have our own rooms? Need we live with the family?" "I dare say that could be managed," replied Barnes quickly. He saw signs of yielding in Peggy's face, and was pleased accordingly. "But you must put on no airs, you know, and you'll have to help Mother with the work." "I don't mind work. I don't mind anything," cried the girl, "but I do want to maintain my self-respect." "Well, there's some sense in that," said Barnes, somewhat mollified, "and I'll go up and talk with Mother right away. But you are an awful fool, Peg. Your father could give you £3 or £4 a week without knowing it was gone, and we could be as happy as turtle doves." A week later, Peg found herself installed at 15 Primrose Terrace, Camden Town. It had cost her a good deal to consent, but consented she had, and for a few days after she had taken up her abode there she felt happier. She did her best to be agreeable to Barnes's two sisters, Edith and Emily, while even Mrs. Barnes was mollified at her evident endeavour to be pleasant. "Yes," said Mrs. Barnes to a neighbour to whom she had given a glowing account of Peggy's advent, "my son has brought his wife home, and as you may say, Mrs. Simpkins, she has brought a new interest to my life. She is a dear little thing, and of course a perfect lady." "I hear her father is a general," said Mrs. Simpkins. "Yes," said Mrs. Barnes, "and will soon be made a baronet or perhaps a lord. Of course it's a very high family. Oh, it was a perfect love match, Mrs. Simpkins." "Well, I hope it will turn out all right," remarked Mrs. Simpkins with a sniff. "I hope so, I'm sure," replied Mrs. Barnes. "And of course she fair worships the ground Jim stands on." "Well, I don't think much of these fine matches. After all, she can't be much of a wife to him. I'll warrant she's never done a day's work in her life, and doesn't know how to cook a dinner." "Of course no lady would," was Mrs. Barnes' reply. "Then what good is she as a wife? What's the use of marrying into a high family if you get no benefit from it? Now, if the General was to allow her, say, £4 a week, there'd be something in it. But there, I suppose he was not agreeable to the match." "My dear Mrs. Simpkins, it's all the other way. He was delighted with our Jim." "Then why didn't they go to Hampstead to live?" asked Mrs. Simpkins. "You say the General lives in a big house. Why shouldn't they lodge there instead of with you?" "Oh, my dear," and Mrs. Barnes gave a knowing smile, "you don't know our Jim. He's a regular Barnes, he is, proud as Lucifer. 'Jim,' says the General to him, 'you come and live with me. My house is open to you.' But Jim wouldn't. 'No, General,' he says, 'I've got me pride, I have, and I'll not accept charity from any one.' That's why he wouldn't take an allowance. But of course Emily and Edith will go up to 'Ampstead sometimes, and very likely Lady Trelawney will come to see me." "I shall believe that when I see it," sniffed Mrs. Simpkins. "What, you don't believe me?" cried Mrs. Barnes indignantly. Didn't you see the General and his son come here the very day they was married? Oh, yes, I know it was a runaway marriage, and no doubt the Trelawneys were a bit angry at the time, but that was before they knew my Jim. What the General said to me that morning was this: 'What's done can't be undone, Mrs. Barnes, and I hope the two families will be friendly,' he says. You'll see, Mrs. Simpkins, you'll see." In spite of this and similar conversations, however, Mrs. Barnes was greatly chagrined at Peggy's insistent refusals to appeal to her parents for help. "What I say is this," she said to her one night. "If you love Jim as you ought to, you'll do everything you can for him. That's what I say. What's the use of having silly pride like that? It isn't as though your parents couldn't afford it." "Jim told me before we were married that he had no need of my father's help," was her reply. "Oh, that's all my eye. Young people talk like that without thinking. And I'll tell you this, Jim won't stand it forever, you know. I'll admit you're not a bad-looking girl, but good looks don't last long, and you're not as pretty as you were when Jim knew you first." Peggy realized this with a sense of bitterness, realized, too, that her clothes were becoming shabby, and that she saw no means of buying new ones. "Of course," went on Mrs. Barnes, "we were all pleased when Jim told us about you at first, but we naturally thought that your father, when he came home, would be sensible. It isn't as though Jim were a common young man. He might have married well, he might. And when he threw up Agnes Parks for you, I gave him a piece of my mind." "Gave up Agnes Parks for me? What do you mean?" "Oh, didn't you know?" and Mrs. Barnes laughed meaningly. "Did you think you were the first girl that Jim ever kissed? Why, he's had dozens of them, my dear. And Agnes Parks was a good chance, too. She has a nice little millinery business of her own, and makes good money. What I says is it's very hard for a young man to give up a girl with money, and to marry somebody who hasn't got a penny, and who is too proud to get it." "I'm not too proud," replied Peggy. "I have tried to get work." Mrs. Barnes laughed sneeringly. "Tried to get work? Yes, but what good are you? It's all very well to say you went to munitions and made good money before the war was over. That's no good now, you know. You're not fit for nothing, and that's why I say Jim was a fool to marry you. If you'd any sense it would be a different thing. Besides, why hasn't your mother come to see you like any decent mother ought?" "Because I've not told them where I am," replied Peggy, "and because I would not have her here." "And why not?" asked Mrs. Barnes indignantly. "We're married into each other's families, and there ought to be a friendship between us. If she was anything like a lady, she'd invite me and the girls to come and see her, and the General would drop in here of a night and smoke a pipe. That's what I should like to see. I told him so straight. I said to him, 'General,' I said, 'you ought to set them up in a nice little home,' I said, 'and give them £1,000 as a nest egg, and then let there be friendship between the two families.' That's what I said to him straight. Now then, run away and lay the dinner table. I'm not going to do the work of the house while you sit here doing nothing." What this kind of thing cost Peggy can be better understood than described. Ever since the first day she came to the house, Mrs. Barnes had insisted on her doing the work of a servant. This the girl had done eagerly, almost gladly. Anything was better than sitting brooding over the past and wondering what the future would bring forth. Much as she hated her associations with Mrs. Barnes, this was not the heaviest burden she had to bear. It was when Barnes's two sisters came home at night, and she had to listen to their taunts, that her life became almost unbearable. For, although the first few days they treated her almost with kindness, their attitude presently changed. The girl could not help being proud and somewhat reserved, and the Misses Barnes instinctively felt that Peggy regarded them as her inferiors. It was this that antagonized them. "Of course," they said to her, "you stay here all day and do nothing while we earn our living. We've not got any aristocratic friends, but let me tell you this, madam, the name of Barnes is just as good as that of Trelawney, and if either of us married we wouldn't be a drag on our husbands. And you need not sniff at the young men we bring home, either. They were Jim's friends before you knew him, and are quite as good as you are." As for Barnes, he did not spend many of his evenings at home. In the main he went out alone, leaving his young wife to do the best she could. "Aren't you ever going to spend an evening at home, Jim?" she said to him one night. "I'll go with you to the movies if you like." "Oh, you've come to that, have you?" laughed Barnes. "Time was when you declared you would not go to such commonplaces." "I'll go anywhere for a little change," was her reply. "We might go to the movies, and even to the theatres, if you'd be sensible," he retorted. "But where am I to get money from for amusements? No, madam, when your dirty pride has come down a bit, and when your father comes off his high horse, I may be able to give you some pleasure, but not till then. As for me, I'm going to get comfort where I can." After she had been at Camden Town a few weeks, she wrote to her sister, begging her to come and see her. She was utterly miserable and depressed, and longed for society other than that of the Barnes family. She had not heard from Eleanor for a long time, and she had not the heart to go and see her, but now she could bear it no longer, and although the Barnes girls had hinted to her that her sister was obliged to leave St. Hildebrand's Mansions, she wrote to her there, and was more than delighted when she got a letter saying that her sister would come to her on the following Sunday afternoon. "May Eleanor come to see us?" cried Barnes when she informed him of her letter. "Of course she may. Mayn't she, mother?" "I suppose so," was Mrs. Barnes' reply. "But she must take us as we are. However, I expect that will be all right, seeing as how she works for her living, the same as other people, and I've never been the one to keep up ill feeling between the two families." During the next 2 days, Mrs. Barnes was more than ordinarily gracious to Peggy, and even went so far as to make special purchases at a local confectioner's in honour of Eleanor's coming. Winter was now upon them, and the days were cold and drear, and if there was one spot more depressing than another in the whole of Camden Town, it was Primrose Terrace. A cold grey mist wrapped the whole neighbourhood like a mantle, and Mrs. Barnes complained that the gas Peggy used in her room would drive her to the poorhouse. On the Sunday afternoon when Eleanor was expected, Peggy sat in her bedroom alone. She had drawn the chair to the window and was watching every passer-by with eagerness. The thought of her sister coming to see her was like a ray of sunshine on a dark day. Never had she realized how dear her own flesh and blood were to her. At length she saw her coming down the street, and then, with an eagerness of which she did not believe herself capable, she rushed downstairs and ran towards the door. "Oh, Eleanor!" she cried. "I am glad you've come. This way, quick! Let us get upstairs before they see us." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 28. Eleanor visits Peggy. When they reached Peggy's bedroom, the two sisters looked at each other for some time without speaking. It seemed as though a barrier stood between them, a barrier that both were afraid to pull down. "I hope you're not cold," said Peggy presently. "There's a fire downstairs, but I wanted to have you a few minutes to myself." "I don't mind the cold," replied Eleanor. "Is anything the matter, Peggy? Why have you come here to live?" I'll tell you all about that presently," replied the girl. "But I want to know about you. These Barnes girls have been saying all sorts of horrible things about you. They aren't true, are they?" "I don't know what they have been saying," replied her sister, "but there's nothing you need to trouble about. Are you still at Speke and Burnham's?" "No," replied the girl. "I've got another place." "Where?" "At another firm in the city." "Good pay?" "The same as I had before." "And that girl, Chellew, isn't she called? She's not living with you, is she? Emily Barnes says but I won't tell you." "No, she's gone away," replied Eleanor calmly. "But another girl lives with me now, one who is in the same office." "Is she nice?" "She's rather colourless and altogether uninteresting, but she's all right. Tell me about yourself. Why have you come here to live?" A flush mounted Peggy's cheeks. "Oh," she said, "I'm so miserable." "Tell me about it." "Jim said we could not afford to live in a place of our own, and it's too horrible to think about." "Why? Aren't they kind to you?" "It's not that so much. They seem to have different feelings. They don't understand, you know. But there, I'm glad to have you. They'll be calling us down to tea in a few minutes, but I just wanted to get you up here alone first. Have you heard from Father and Mother?" "Not often," replied Eleanor. "They came to see me soon after I left home. I told you about that. They've written to me twice since, and I replied that I preferred to stay where I was, and to be alone. Then John wrote, asking if he might come to see me, and I told him no." Peggy gave a quivering sigh. "Do you know Trev's home?" she asked. "He's engaged." "Is he? Do we know the girl?" "No, but they say she's wonderful." "How do you know?" "They came to see me. That is, Father and Mother did, before I came here." "Tell me about it," cried Eleanor eagerly. "Why did they come to see you? Did they say anything about me?" Then Peggy, unable to contain herself further, told her sister the story of the past few months. "And they asked you to go home?" "Yes, and oh, I did so long to go." "Why didn't you?" "Would you?" "How could I? They refuse to have anything to do with Jim. They have insulted him again and again, and after what I had said to them, I could not." "I wish you'd let me know how poor you were," said Eleanor presently. "I would have helped you." "But I thought you had only just enough to pay your way." "Yes, but I would have managed to help you somehow." "Would you? Oh, but I could not take anything. I couldn't really. I say, Eleanor, it hasn't been a great success, has it?" Eleanor was silent. "Why haven't you been to see me?" asked Peggy presently. Still the other girl did not speak. "Oh, you need not be afraid to tell me," and Peggy noted her sister's looks. "I know what you feel. You never liked Jim, I know, and now it's worse than ever." "Do you still like him?" asked Eleanor. "Is he kind to you?" "Of course he's kind to me," lied Peggy, in an attempt to be loyal. "And of course I'm fond of him, but—" "Yes?" "It's being here," the girl almost sobbed. "His mother and sisters are just awful. Sometimes I think they mean to be kind, but they don't understand. They seem to think that Father and Mother should come to see them, and should make Jim an allowance. They laugh at what they call my pride, because I won't write home for help. If I could only get away, if we two could be together. But you have told me nothing about yourself, and I want to know. Do you see much of Tamsin Cory now?" "No." "Why not? Have you quarrelled?" "I don't see anything of her anyhow." "Do you go to the Amazon Club?" "No, I haven't been for a long time." "Why?" "I haven't, that's all." Oh, Eleanor, I do wish I could go home." "Why don't you?" "I can't. You know I can't. I could not leave Jim, and they won't have him. I say, couldn't we manage to live together? You say you have a fairly good salary, and if Jim could find a cheap place, couldn't you come and live with us? We might manage then." "I must think about it," replied Eleanor after a long silence. "Perhaps it might be managed." "I know you don't like Jim," persisted Peggy, "but I wish you could. I would do anything to get away from these people here. It's not only Jim's sisters, but their young men who come to see them. They're simply awful. They expect me to laugh at their jokes and to be friendly with them, but I can't. I simply can't. You'll see them presently, and then you'll understand. There, tea is ready. Mrs. Barnes is coming for us." "Come now, you two girls," said Mrs. Barnes, entering the room. "Tea is ready. How are you, Miss Trelawney?" holding out her hand to Eleanor. "Glad to see you, I'm sure. I expected you to come here a lot after Jim and your sister were married. I'm not the one to bear malice. I say let's be friends, but come down right away. Tea's all on the table, and I don't keep it after 5 o'clock to please nobody, especially on a Sunday afternoon." Evidently the occasion was intended to be an important one. A round table, too large for the room, had been placed in the centre of what they called their drawing room, and was covered with a large amount of eatables. Chairs were drawn up all round it as if for a large party. No sooner had Eleanor and Peggy come down than Emily and Edith Barnes, followed by their swains, came out of the back room, while Jim Barnes stood at the foot of the stairs waiting to receive them. "Hello, Eleanor!" cried Barnes with a great show of heartiness. "Now this is what I call something like. I'm sure I'm pleased to see you. How are you? What, not one kiss for your brother-in-law? Come now, I say, I must salute my sister with a brotherly kiss." And Barnes put his hand on her shoulder as if to carry his words into effect. "Yes, and why not?" said Mrs. Barnes, as Eleanor drew away. "I'm sure nothing could be more natural. My husband's brother, Andrew Barnes, he was a clerk in a surveyor's office, he was, always came to see us twice a week after we were married, and he never failed to kiss me. I should have thought it funny if he hadn't." "Nothing doing, Jim?" cried Emily's swain, a young man who rejoiced in the name of Sam Pilling. "I say, that's too bad." Sam Pilling was Emily Barnes's latest conquest. Both the young men who were at Primrose Terrace on the night General Trelawney first returned from abroad had long since been forgotten. "But I think the young lady's quite right," went on Pilling. "Kissing ain't for public, I say. It's a private affair. What do you say, Miss Trelawney?" "Well, kissing or no kissing," interposed Mrs. Barnes, "it's tea time, and I hate tea when it's overbrewed or when it gets cold. Overbrewed tea always gives me indigestion. As for cold tea, it's just horrible. There now, sit down. The table is rather small for so many of us, so you'll have to squeeze up." "Not the slightest objection to squeezing, Mrs. Barnes," laughed Pilling. "Indeed, I think it's okay. There now, we're all snug and comfortable. Plenty of room, haven't you, Miss Trelawney? Tell me if I'm squeezing you too tight." At this there was a general titter, although Emily Barnes was much annoyed that Pilling should have chosen to sit beside Eleanor instead of herself. "Eleanor won't mind," remarked Emily when the laughter had subsided. "Will you?" The girl was saved the pain of answering by Mrs. Barnes asking in a loud voice who would and who would not have sugar. "Look here, mother," said Barnes, after that lady had finished pouring out tea. This cake and stuff is all very well, but both Pilling and Leatherhead have come all the way from Balham, and they'll be a bit peckish. Haven't you got anything more substantial?" "Oh, yes," replied Mrs. Barnes cheerfully. "I boiled a bit of 'am yesterday, and it's on the sideboard in the other room. If anybody would like to have a bit of 'am, say so. Will you, Eleanor, my dear? Make yourself quite at home. You're one of the family, and I'm not going to call you Miss Trelawney any more. Jim," shouted Mrs. Barnes to her son, who had gone to cut the ham, "there's some mustard in the cupboard, and pepper and salt too, if anybody wants it. But I'm afraid it's too much of a crush to have the pickles out." "Aren't you having any ham, Miss Trelawney?" asked Pilling, who was vigorously plying his knife and fork. His people originally came from Yorkshire, where what they called high teas are common. Eleanor replied in the negative. "Oh, well, London ways are all very well," remarked Pilling, "but give me old Yorkshire. It may be a bit rough up there, but we know what's what." In her endeavour to be agreeable, Eleanor entered into conversation with Pilling, who seemed to find her company vastly entertaining. Indeed, he became so interested in what Eleanor said that he paid but little attention to Emily Barnes on the other side of the table. As a consequence, that lady became jealous. In addition, she had anything but kindly feelings towards Eleanor. She remembered the conversation between them on Hampstead Heath some time before, which had rankled ever since. "She thinks she's honouring us by being here to tea," she reflected, "but I'll pay her out before long." "Now this is what I like," remarked Mrs. Barnes presently. "All the children 'ome and everybody 'appy. Yes, I know things are terribly dear, but dear as they are, I hope everybody will have a good meal. That's what my poor husband used to say when people came in to have a bite with us. 'Cut and come again' was his motto. Ah, but things are different now from what they were then." "I say," said Leatherhead, who, sitting next to Edith Barnes, was enjoying himself vastly, "couldn't the whole lot of us do a theatre to-morrow night? Come now, Mrs. Barnes, couldn't you shut up the house for one evening? There's a good piece on at the Lyceum, and nothing would please me better than to pay for 2 or 3 seats. What do you say, Pilling?" "I'm game," said Pilling, "and I've heard the play's a good one. Plenty of fighting and spying and mystery. That's the sort of thing I like. What do you say, Miss Trelawney? I'm sure it will give me great pleasure to take you." "I'm afraid I can't," replied Eleanor. "But why? Have you another engagement?" "Of course she has," said Emily Barnes, who thought she saw a chance of paying that stuck-up Trelawney girl out, as she called it. "The Lyceum is too tame for her. She prefers going to the Frivolity with Mr. Wakeham, and to some place to supper afterwards. By the way, how is Mr. Wakeham, Eleanor?" "Come, come, Emily, that's going a bit too far," interposed Barnes. "Why is it going too far?" asked Emily, by this time madly jealous at the attention her lover was paying Eleanor. "She does go to the Frivolity with Mr. Wakeham, and a man I know told me he saw them at supper at the Azure Sky, one of those fast night clubs that was raided. Of course Mr. Wakeham is a married man, but that doesn't matter, does it? Come now, it's no use getting huffy about it. We know what we know." A flush of shame surmounted the girl's face, and she did not know what to say. She felt as though her horrible experiences of the evening to which Emily referred must be known to all London, and she would have given anything to have got out of the room. Her previous experiences during the afternoon were painful enough, but she felt that this was more than she could bear. "And what if a girl does go out for an evening's enjoyment?" cried Pilling, who evidently admired Eleanor very much. As far as I know, there's no harm in the friv or going out for a bit of supper and a hop afterwards. Everybody does it these days." "Some people seem very lucky," sneered Emily. "It isn't every typist that can drink champagne with their suppers." "No, it isn't," laughed Pilling. "I wish I could get it sometimes." "Now, if we've all finished tea," broke in Mrs. Barnes, "you'd better get into the other room. Peggy and I will wash up the tea things. Now, Miss Trelawney, you must not take any notice of Emily. She's a bit tart with her tongue, but she doesn't mean anything wrong. Go into the sitting room and make yourself at home. There's a nice fire there." "I'm afraid I can't stay any longer," replied Eleanor. "I must go." "But not yet," objected Mrs. Barnes. "It's only just turned 6." "Thank you, I really must get back." "Well, if you will, you will," assented Mrs. Barnes after a great many protestations had been made. "But I don't see any reason why. We expected you to spend the evening with us." "I'll see you home anyhow," said Barnes. "No, no, please don't trouble," replied Eleanor. "I can quickly get to the station from here." "Couldn't think of it," persisted Barnes. "What, see my own sister-in-law go home alone? No, indeed, that wouldn't do." "But I really prefer it," urged the girl. "I couldn't think of your leaving Peg." "Oh, Peg's all right. I often leave her of an evening. You see, she has mother now. I'll put on my overcoat right away." "But I really couldn't dream of it," said Eleanor with a note in her voice which even Barnes could not help noticing. "Do you mean to say you'd rather not have me?" he said with heightened voice. "Very well, I'm not the one to push my company upon anyone." "Oh, please don't take it that way," said Eleanor, who was anxious for Peggy's sake not to have any unpleasantness. "But I really would prefer to be alone." "Of course she would," laughed Emily. "No doubt she has her engagements, Jim, and although you have married a girl without a penny to her name, the Trelawneys think themselves superior to the Barnes." Peggy had listened to all this in positive agony. She had heard a garbled account of what Emily Barnes had said to her sister when they met on Hampstead Heath, but she had no idea that the girl would have said such things before others. She saw how every word had cut Eleanor like a knife, saw the anger and pain which she had tried to suppress. "Emily," she cried passionately, "I did not bring my sister here to be insulted. Had I known, she should not have come." "Well, we didn't want her," retorted Emily. "We may be common people, but we are respectable. Stick up for your family, Jim. Talk about insult indeed. We don't go to night clubs with married men. Of course she wouldn't let you kiss her, Jim, but I'll warrant she was not so particular about Mr. Wakeham. Her own brother-in-law isn't good enough for her." "Oh, do let me get out of this," cried Eleanor, losing control over herself. "Put on your hat and come with me to the station, Peg." "That's it, is it?" shouted Barnes. "You wouldn't let me come with you, but you'll drag Peg out. I'm going to have a kiss before you go." What happened after that, Eleanor could hardly tell. She remembered a wild struggle with Barnes, and presently found herself in the street, with Peggy by her side. As they neared Camden Town Station, she grew calmer. "I couldn't, Peg. Really, I couldn't," she said. "Couldn't what?" asked Peggy. "Couldn't live with you and that man. Forgive me, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I really couldn't." Peggy was silent. She realized what was in her sister's mind, and while she felt somewhat angry, she could not blame her. "I hate the thought of you going back to them," said Eleanor presently. "It's horrible, simply too horrible," ejaculated the other. "Look here, Come with me to live. We could manage somehow. I need not pay any more for rooms. You shall sleep with me, as you used to when we were kiddies, and perhaps I could find you work." Peggy's eyes flashed at this, and for a moment she seemed as though she would accept her sister's suggestion. She shook her head despondently, however. "No," she said, "I can't leave Jim. But forgive me for asking you there. If I had known—" "Oh, never mind me," interrupted her sister. "I'm all right. It's you I'm thinking about. Come and see me often, Peg. I nearly always stay in of an evening now, and I get home from business at 6:30. "I dare not," replied the girl. "They say things bad enough to me now." When she returned to Primrose Terrace, she went straight to her bedroom and sat there in the dark. Barnes heard her come in, and when she didn't come downstairs and join the others, he went to her. "What are you moping here for?" he asked angrily. "Why don't you come down with the rest and be pleasant?" "I want to be alone, Jim," was her reply. "Alone? Why do you want to be alone? Oh, you're thinking about Eleanor, I suppose. Well, what business had she to be so hoity-toity?" Peg did not reply. "Aren't you going to speak? Aren't you coming down with the others and be pleasant?" Still she was silent. "Oh, hang your dirty pride," he said with an oath. "Well, if I can't have a bit of comfort here, I shall go where I can." Soon after, he left the house. After that, Peggy's life became a perfect misery. Mrs. Barnes upbraided her with being utterly useless, besides being a drag on the family. "If you'd only be sensible," said Mrs. Barnes, "Jim would like you better, but how can he care about a girl who is always peevish and never brings a penny to help? Oh, I tell you straight, we are not going to stand it much longer. The girls are complaining too, and say the place isn't like home any longer. If you want to keep Jim, you'd better swallow your pride and get your family to help you. What would a few pounds a week be to them? Nothing, and it would be a great deal to us." As for Barnes, he seldom stayed in the house at night. When he came home from work, he partook of his food in silence and then went out alone, while Mrs. Barnes and her daughters would look at each other significantly. "Do you know where Jim goes to?" asked Peggy on one occasion. "He won't tell me." "Oh, he goes where he can have pleasant society," retorted Emily. "It's no use saying I like it," said Mrs. Barnes woefully, "but Jim was always that way, and I've always said that he liked Agnes best of all the girls he kept company with. Of course she has a nice house too, and nobody would be pleasanter or more entertaining than Jim when he's a mind to." A little later Peggy realized that an air of mystery prevailed in the house. There was nothing definite upon which she could fasten, but from the sudden silence which fell upon Mrs. Barnes and her daughters whenever she entered the room, she could not help realizing that they were discussing matters about which they did not wish her to know. "Have you seen your sister lately?" asked Mrs. Barnes of her one day. "I've only seen her once since she was here," replied Peggy. "But you should, my dear," urged the woman with a show of friendliness. "We don't want to be a disturbing element between relations. Of course she thinks herself too good to come here again." "And we think ourselves too good to have her," snapped Emily. "Still, I say you ought to go and see her sometimes," continued Mrs. Barnes. At that moment Barnes came back to his dinner, and evidently something unpleasant had happened, for he was in a bad temper. "I was just saying to Peggy that she ought to go and see her sister oftener. Why don't you spend a Saturday afternoon with her? Typists are always free of a Saturday afternoon." "Would you mind if I went, Jim?" asked Peggy, and there was eagerness in her voice. "I don't care where you go," was his reply. "You can throw yourself in the river for all I care." "Come, Jim, you don't mean that," said his mother coaxingly. "Don't mind him, Peggy, my dear. You go and have a chat with your sister. It will do you good." It came about, therefore, that on the following Saturday afternoon Peggy made her way to Eleanor's rooms. "Look here, Peg," said Eleanor. "I'm not going to ask you any questions, but we're going to have a jolly time. I have been very economical lately, and I can afford to give you a treat. We will go to a matinee of Cheech and Chow this afternoon, and then we'll go to a nice place for tea, and after that we'll come home here and spend the evening together." "That's awfully good of you. You're sure you can afford it?" "Perfectly sure." "It will be lovely," cried Peggy, "but I must not get home later than 9 o'clock." "That can be easily managed. Come on." For nearly 3 hours the girls forgot their troubles in the brilliant spectacle at His Majesty's Theatre, and afterwards, according to Eleanor's programme, they went to a cosy tea room where they spent some time together. "We've had a glorious time," cried Peggy, when at length they reached Eleanor's room. "But, Eleanor, you don't seem happy." "Don't bother about me. I'm all right. And don't let's think of anything unpleasant. Let's talk about old times, when we were kiddies together." For more than 2 hours they chatted together as girls will. Eleanor appeared to be gay, almost hilariously so, while Peggy, forgetting for a moment her associations with Primrose Terrace, seemed something like the Peggy of old times. "Oh, if we could only live together, Eleanor, if we could only spend our evenings like this." "But we can't," replied the other. "I must say it, Peg. I simply could not stand that man. I know you have married him, but he's impossible. Won't you leave him and come with me?" "No," replied Peggy. Even yet she felt she must be loyal to him. The evening before he had remained at home, and she thought he appeared kinder and more thoughtful. Just before 9 o'clock, Peggy left St. Hildebrand's Mansions for Camden Town, and she shuddered as she made her way through the cold wintry night. It was not raining, but the air was dank and depressing. The streets were muddy and miserable. As she neared the station her mind flashed, in spite of herself, to her old home. Her conversation with her sister had brought up 1,000 memories of those days before the war, when as children they laughed and romped in the great playroom. She thought of a party they had once had, when her father had come into the room dressed as Santa Claus, and had given them all sorts of presents. What fun they had! What laughter! And she had given it all up for this. She was still only a child in years, and yet she felt that her childhood was passing from her, and that she had nothing to look forward to but a lifetime's association with the Barnes family. How mad she had been! Not only mad, but wicked. For she had been wicked. She felt it now. She remembered the look on her father's face as she saw him last, realized how old and how haggard he appeared. And yet he had been kind and loving through it all. Then she thought of her mother, thought also of the way she had defied her and threatened her, and why had she done it? How had it all ended? Would Barnes be home when she arrived at Primrose Terrace? She did not expect him. She almost hoped he would not be. Oh, the horror of the place, the miserable, squalid, coarse, common horror of it all. Yes, she had been a fool, and worse than a fool. She, too, had been common and vulgar. She had been enamoured of people of whom she now felt ashamed. Fancy introducing Barnes to her father's friends. But more than that, she had been wicked. Yes, positively wicked. She had saddened the lives of both her father and her mother. Again her mind flashed back to the old home of her childhood, and she remembered how her father used to put her to bed and listen to her while she said her prayers. She called to mind the words with which she always finished her prayers. God bless Daddy and Mummy and Trev and John and Eleanor, and make me a good girl, and bless everybody and make them happy for Christ's sake. Amen. She had laughed at all this. Now she was going back to Camden Town, to Primrose Terrace, and to the Barnes family. She left the train at Camden Town and found her way through the dismal muddy streets to Primrose Terrace. When she arrived at number 13, she found the place in darkness. What did it mean? Mrs. Barnes never went out in the evening, although the girls always went to the pictures on a Saturday evening, and generally returned about 10:30 with their young men. She tried the door. It was locked, and silence reigned in the house. The houses on either side of number 13 were also in darkness. What should she do? Perhaps Mrs. Barnes thought she would not be home until late, and had gone with her daughters to the movies. She remembered a picture palace in the main street, not far away. She would go there and spend an hour. By that time Mrs. Barnes would have returned. A little later she had partially forgotten her troubles in watching an impossible story being reproduced on the screen. Then, when it was over, she came out into the street again. A clock near by struck 10:30. She hurried back to Primrose Terrace and found that number 13 was still in darkness. What could it mean? They knew she was out, and she had told them she should return about 9:00. She seized the rusty knocker and rapped at the door. There was no response. She knocked louder. Still no answer. She began to be frightened. Something had happened, and with a kind of frenzy she knocked still louder. Then she heard a movement in the adjoining house, and the door opened. "Who's that?" "It's I, Mrs. Simpkins, Mrs. Jim Barnes." "Oh, it's you, is it? Well, Mrs. Barnes asked me to tell you when you came back that she and her girls had gone away for a bit of an holiday." "But where?" "I don't know nothing about that. She said they might be away several days. I expect this letter will tell you all you want to know. She asked me to give it to you if you should come. Good night. Dark, ain't it?" And the woman sniggered meaningly. Peggy took the letter like one in a dream. She was too bewildered to readily comprehend the meaning of it all. She walked to the nearest lamp post and opened the letter. It was in Barnes's handwriting, but there was no address or signature. "I've had enough of it," she read, "and so I expect have you. If you want your liberty, you can easily get it. I'm going my way, and you can go yours." End of chapter 28.